In the late spring of 1945, as the final weeks of World War II unfolded in Europe, a small column of American soldiers made their way through the winding roads of Austria. The war was almost over, but uncertainty still hung in the air. Scattered resistance, pockets of desperate German troops, and the eerie silence of a collapsing empire surrounded them. Most of these soldiers had no idea that what they were about to encounter would become one of the strangest, most improbable battles in history. A fight where American troops, German soldiers, and French prisoners would all take up arms together against the fanatical remnants of the SS. The story begins at Itter Castle, a medieval stone fortress perched above the Austrian village of Itter in the Tyrol region. For centuries, it had stood quietly among the mountains, but during the Nazi era, it was turned into a prison unlike any other. Officially a subcamp of Dachau, Itter Castle housed a group of extremely high-profile prisoners, France's political elite. Inside its thick walls were men who had once governed a nation. Former Prime Ministers Edouard Daladier and Paul Reynaud, General Maurice Gamelin, labor leader Léon Jouot, tennis champion Jean Barotra, and others. Even a sister of Charles de Gaulle, Marie-Agnes Caillot, was imprisoned there. These men were not ordinary captives. They were hostages, valuable bargaining chips Hitler hoped to use as leverage should the war turn against him. The prison was run by the SS, and while the inmates enjoyed slightly better treatment than those in concentration camps, the uncertainty of their fate weighed heavily on them. They knew that as the Allies drew closer, their value to the Nazis would diminish. Many feared that the SS might execute them rather than let them be liberated. On May 2, 1945, the unexpected happened. The commandant of the prison, Sebastian Wimmer, an SS officer who had long grown weary of the war and the chaos around him, decided to flee. He took his men and abandoned the castle, leaving the French prisoners alone. For the first time in years, they were unguarded, but also isolated, surrounded by enemy forces and unsure who to trust. Among the few remaining figures in the castle was Andreas Krobot, a courageous Czech cook who had been working there under duress. Realizing that the prisoners' lives were in danger, he decided to act. He sneaked out of the castle, slipping through the forest and dodging patrols, determined to find help. After a long and dangerous journey, he encountered a unit of German soldiers, not die-hard Nazis, but Wehrmacht troops under the command of Major Joseph Sepp Gangl, stationed in the nearby town of Wurgl. Gangl was a career officer, a man who had served faithfully but was now disillusioned with the regime. He had seen the devastation Hitler's ambitions had caused and no longer believed in the fight. In the final weeks of the war, his priority had shifted to protecting civilians from the fanatical SS units that roamed the countryside, killing anyone suspected of desertion or disloyalty. When Krobot told him about the French prisoners trapped in Itter Castle, Gangl made a decision that would define his life. He would help rescue them, even if it meant joining forces with the Americans. Gangl contacted Captain John C. Jack Lee Jr., an officer of the U.S. 23rd Tank Battalion, 12th Armored Division. Lee was a bold and resourceful commander, known for his courage and improvisation. At first, Lee was skeptical. A German officer asking for help to save French prisoners sounded like a trap. But something in Gangl's manner convinced him it was genuine. After verifying the situation, Lee agreed to cooperate. It was an extraordinary alliance. American troops and Wehrmacht soldiers fighting together against the SS. Lee gathered a small detachment, just a single tank, a Sherman nicknamed Besotten Jenny, and about a dozen men. Gangl brought along 10 of his own soldiers. Together, this unlikely force set out toward Itter Castle on the evening of May 4, 1945. As they advanced through the narrow Tyrolean roads, they encountered occasional skirmishes with retreating SS units. The air was tense, every sound amplified by the mountains. When they finally reached the outskirts of the village of Itter, The local resistance and a few villagers guided them to the castle. The prisoners, who had been anxiously watching from the battlements, could hardly believe their eyes when they saw an American tank rolling up the hill, escorted by German soldiers who weren't there to harm them but to defend them. Once inside, Lee and Gangle quickly assessed the situation. The castle was a strong defensive position, but they were vastly outnumbered. Intelligence reports indicated that a force of over 100 SS troops from the 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division was moving toward them. The prisoners, though prominent politicians and intellectuals, insisted on helping prepare the defenses. Jean Barotra, the former tennis champion, volunteered to act as a runner, offering to slip through enemy lines if needed to contact reinforcements. By nightfall, the defenders took up positions around the castle walls and the Sherman tank was stationed at the gate. They had limited ammunition, no heavy artillery, and no hope of immediate reinforcements. Yet morale was high. There was something surreal about the situation. American and German soldiers standing shoulder to shoulder, defending a medieval castle full of French VIPs against an oncoming SS assault, just days before Germany's surrender. At dawn on May 5, 1945, the SS attack began. Machine gun fire echoed through the valley, bullets sparking off the castle walls. The defenders returned fire, using rifles and the tank's gun to keep the attackers at bay. The Sherman's cannon thundered, shaking the ground, but soon it was disabled by a well-placed anti-tank shot. Smoke filled the air, and the defenders fell back to the inner walls. The battle raged for hours as the SS tried repeatedly to storm the gates. Inside, the French prisoners refused to hide. Daladier and Reynaud, former political rivals, now fought side by side with carbines in hand. Jouot helped carry ammunition. Even the castle's cook and servants joined the defense. Above the chaos, the French tricolor and an American flag fluttered together, a symbol of unity in the face of madness. As the fighting grew desperate, Gangle was struck by a sniper's bullet while trying to move a civilian out of harm's way. He was killed instantly. His sacrifice became legendary, a German officer who died defending French prisoners alongside Americans against the SS. By mid-afternoon, the defenders were nearly out of ammunition, and it seemed only a matter of time before the SS would overrun them. Then, faintly, the distant rumble of engines echoed through the valley, the sound of American reinforcements. The defenders of Itter Castle were exhausted, pinned down behind stone walls scarred by gunfire. The SS assault showed no sign of slowing. They had already surrounded the hill, cutting off escape routes and hammering the fortress with rifles, machine guns, and light artillery. Inside, Captain Lee's men, the remaining Wehrmacht soldiers, and the French prisoners were running dangerously low on ammunition. Every bullet had to count. The noise was deafening, gunfire echoing off the mountain slopes, the deep thud of grenades, the shouts of men in German and English blending together in the chaos. The Sherman tank, once their greatest advantage, sat crippled near the gate, its treads shattered. Still, its hull provided vital cover for the defenders who fired through its openings. Lee moved constantly from position to position, shouting encouragement, checking on the wounded, and making quick tactical decisions. His calmness under fire inspired everyone around him. Meanwhile, the French prisoners, statesmen, generals, intellectuals, continued to fight like soldiers. Jean Barotra, agile and fearless despite his age, climbed the walls to spot enemy movements. Paul Reynaud and Edouard Daladier, who had once led France through political turmoil, now took turns at the parapets, firing rifles at the General Gamelin, who had been disgraced after France's defeat in 1940, found a rifle and took up a defensive post as if to redeem his honor. But their efforts could only delay the inevitable. The SS troops were determined, ruthless, and far more numerous. Each wave came closer to breaching the gate. Then, amid the smoke and chaos, Lee realized they couldn't hold out much longer. If reinforcements didn't arrive soon, they would all be overrun. At that moment, Jean Barotra volunteered for a dangerous mission. The French tennis champion offered to slip past the German lines and reach the nearest American unit for help. Lee hesitated. Sending a man alone through enemy territory seemed like suicide. But Barotra was insistent. "Let me do it," he said. "I'm fast, and they'll never expect me." After a brief exchange, Lee agreed. Under cover of darkness and gunfire, Barotra climbed down from the castle walls and disappeared into the forest. He moved quickly and silently, dodging patrols and following back roads. Hours passed before he finally reached an American reconnaissance patrol from the 142nd Infantry Regiment of the 36th Division. Breathless and covered in dirt, he explained the situation. A castle full of French VIPs, defended by Americans and German soldiers, surrounded by SS troops. The patrol leader couldn't believe it, but Barotra's urgency left no doubt. Back at the castle, the defenders were still holding on by sheer determination. The SS launched another assault at dawn, supported by machine guns set up on the slopes below. Bullets ricocheted off the walls, and several defenders were wounded. Captain Lee was hit in the arm by shrapnel but refused medical attention. He kept shouting orders, directing fire, and rallying his men. Every shot counted. Then, just as the situation became critical, the distant rumble of engines returned. Louder this time, unmistakable. A column of American armored vehicles was racing up the valley, led by troops from the 142nd Infantry. Behind them came tanks, jeeps, and half-tracks, kicking up dust as they advanced toward the sound of battle. When the first U.S. vehicles appeared on the road below, the defenders at Itter Castle erupted in cheers. The SS, realizing they were about to be caught between two forces, began to falter. Some tried to retreat down the hillside, but the Americans opened fire, cutting off their escape. Within minutes, the SS assault collapsed. Dozens were killed, and the rest scattered into the woods, surrendering or fleeing toward the mountains. The battle for Itter Castle was over. It had lasted less than a day but left behind a scene unlike anything else in the war. American and German soldiers standing together amid the ruins, their uniforms stained with smoke and dust, surrounded by the men they had saved. France's most prominent leaders. The French prisoners emerged from the castle, some embracing their rescuers, others still in shock. Edouard Daladier, the former prime minister, shook Captain Lee's hand and thanked him with tears in his eyes. "You have saved France's honor," he said. Jean Barotra, having returned with the relief column, was greeted as a hero. Even the hardened American soldiers were struck by the surreal mix of joy, disbelief, and exhaustion that filled the courtyard. But amid the celebration, there was also grief. Major Joseph Sepp Gangl, the German officer who had risked everything to help the Americans and defend the prisoners, lay dead, shot by a sniper while trying to protect a civilian. His sacrifice was not forgotten. The French prisoners insisted that he be buried with full military honors. In the days that followed, the town of Wurgel named a street after him, honoring him as a hero of Austria and of humanity. For Captain John C. Lee Jr., the Battle of Itter Castle became the defining moment of his military career. His courage and leadership under impossible circumstances earned him the Distinguished Service Cross. Yet, when asked about the fight later, he would simply say that it was the right thing to do. "Those men were in danger," he told one reporter, "and it didn't matter what uniform they wore." As word of the battle spread among Allied troops, many could hardly believe it. The idea that American and German soldiers had fought together, side by side, against the SS seemed impossible, and yet it had happened. Itter Castle became a symbol of humanity amidst the insanity of war, a moment where old enemies put aside hatred for a common cause. When Germany officially surrendered on May 8th, just 3 days later, the war in Europe finally ended. For those who had fought at Ytter Castle, the memory of that day would never fade. They had witnessed one of history's rarest moments, a battle not for conquest or revenge, but for decency, honor, and survival. In the years after the war, historians would revisit the strange events of May 5, 1945. The battle for Castle Ytter came to be known as the last battle of World War II in Europe. Though that wasn't technically true, it captured the spirit of those final, chaotic days. Books, documentaries, and later films would immortalize the story, but none could fully capture the tension and courage of that day in the Tyrolean mountains. For the French prisoners, the experience changed them profoundly. They had been captives of a regime that sought to destroy their country, yet they were freed by an alliance no one could have predicted. Many of them spoke later about the extraordinary bravery of their rescuers, not just the Americans, but also Major Gangle and his men, who had defied orders and risked execution to do what was right. When peace finally returned to Europe, Ytter Castle fell silent again. It stood as it always had, overlooking the green valleys of Tyrol, a stone witness to centuries of history. But for those who knew its story, it was more than just a medieval fortress. It was a monument to an extraordinary act of cooperation and courage at the very edge of a world consumed by war. After the smoke cleared and the echoes of gunfire faded from the Tyrolean valley, a heavy silence settled over Ytter Castle. The battle had ended, but its impact lingered in the stunned faces of those who had survived it. The men who had defended the fortress, Americans, Germans, and French alike, stood among the rubble, surrounded by the smell of burnt powder and stone dust. The realization slowly sank in. They had just fought one of the strangest and most improbable battles of the entire war. Captain Jack Lee was the first to break the quiet. He walked across the courtyard, checking on his men, helping the wounded, and offering words of comfort to the French prisoners. His uniform was torn, his arm wrapped in a blood-stained bandage, but he carried himself with calm authority. Around him, the freed prisoners were still processing what had happened. For some, the shock of survival was harder to absorb than the fear of death had been. The castle's medieval walls, once a symbol of imprisonment, now seemed like a sanctuary. The prisoners, men who had spent years under Nazi control, could finally breathe freely. They gathered in the courtyard, some sitting on broken stones, others standing silently, gazing toward the mountains. The sunlight that broke through the clouds that afternoon felt like a sign that the nightmare was finally ending. Among them, General Maurice Gamelin stood apart, looking out at the hills where the SS had fled. The same man who had commanded the French army at the beginning of the war now found himself saved by the cooperation of his former enemies. He said little, but his expression revealed the mixture of gratitude and regret that weighed on him. Jean Barotra, the energetic tennis star who had risked his life to bring reinforcements, moved between groups, checking on his fellow countrymen. His quick wit and athletic energy had helped sustain morale during captivity, and now he was the embodiment of relief and pride. Every few moments, someone would clasp his hand or clap him on the shoulder, thanking him for his daring run through the enemy lines. Captain Lee and his men, meanwhile, surveyed the damage. The Sherman tank Besatten Jenny was a wreck, its armor scorched and tracks blown apart. The courtyard was littered with shell casings and debris, while several sections of the wall were pockmarked from heavy gunfire. Miraculously, the defenders had suffered relatively few casualties, though several men were wounded. Major Sepp Gangle's death, however, cast a long shadow over the victory. Lee ordered that Gangle's body be moved to a shaded corner of the courtyard. The French prisoners gathered around, and a brief, solemn ceremony was held. Paul Reynaud, the former Prime Minister of France, spoke softly in French, his voice breaking with emotion as he praised the German officer's courage. "This man," he said, "proved that honor does not wear a single uniform." The Americans stood at attention, removing their helmets in respect. It was a quiet, dignified farewell, one soldier saluting another, beyond politics or nationality. That evening, as the sun set over the Alps, the castle fell into an exhausted stillness. The surviving defenders ate a simple meal together: bread, cheese, and whatever rations remained. For the first time, laughter began to replace the sound of gunfire. The Frenchmen shared stories of Paris, of politics, of how they had ended up in that unlikely place. The Americans listened, amused and curious, while the remaining German soldiers sat quietly, aware that their war was over. Captain Lee later wrote in his report that the French dignitaries were in good spirits despite the ordeal. He described them as grateful, dignified, and surprisingly calm. Yet he also noted how surreal the scene had been. Dining in a medieval castle with men who had once ruled France, after fighting alongside German soldiers against the SS. It was, he said, a moment out of history, almost impossible to believe. The following morning, May 6th, American reinforcements secured the area and began the process of evacuating the French prisoners. Armored vehicles arrived, followed by trucks to transport the rescued men to safety. As they prepared to leave, the prisoners gathered one last time in the courtyard. They thanked Captain Lee, his men, and the remaining German soldiers who had helped defend them. There were handshakes, embraces, and a few tears. Before departing, Jean Barotra approached Lee and pressed a small tennis medal into his hand. "A reminder," he said with a smile, "that courage sometimes serves in unexpected places." Lee nodded, tucking the medal into his pocket, a token he would keep for the rest of his life. The convoy rolled down the winding road from Itter Castle, past the fields and forests that had been battlegrounds just hours earlier. Villagers from Itter and Wurgel lined the road, waving cautiously, uncertain of what to make of the mixed group of soldiers. For the locals, the sight of Americans and Germans traveling together in peace was something no one had ever imagined. As the vehicles reached Wurgel, the townspeople learned of Major Gangel's death. The news spread quickly, and within days, they organized a funeral procession in his honor. American officers attended, as did several French prisoners who had insisted on staying to pay their respects. Flowers covered the German officer's grave, and his name was soon inscribed on a memorial stone. To this day, a street in Wurgel bears his name, Joseph Gangelstrasse, a lasting tribute to his bravery. Captain Lee returned to his unit shortly afterward. The war in Europe ended officially on May 8th, with Germany's unconditional surrender. But even in victory, Lee found it difficult to forget what had happened at Itter Castle. The events had shaken his understanding of the war, showing him that even in the darkest times, humanity could shine through the chaos. In the years that followed, the story of the battle for Itter Castle became a piece of military legend. Newspapers in the United States and France published accounts of the incredible alliance between former enemies. The New York Times called it the strangest battle of the war. For the men who had fought there, however, it was more than a story. It was a memory of courage, fear, and unexpected brotherhood. The castle itself, once a place of captivity, became a symbol of redemption. For a time after the war, it stood abandoned, its walls still scarred by the battle. Tourists and soldiers visited occasionally, leaving flowers or notes of remembrance. In the 1970s, new owners restored parts of the building, preserving its history. But even as it changed hands over the decades, Itter Castle's legacy remained tied to that single extraordinary day in May 1945. In France, the surviving prisoners lived out their post-war years with a renewed sense of purpose. Paul Reynaud returned to political life, speaking often about the courage of the men who had saved him. Jean Barotra continued to play tennis and became a celebrated sports figure once more, telling the story of his escape and rescue in countless interviews. Each of them remembered Idar Castle not just as a place of imprisonment, but as a place of freedom, where enemies became allies and ideals triumphed over ideology. For many of the Americans involved, the memory of that battle stayed vivid long after the war. Some wrote memoirs. Others never spoke of it again, carrying the experience quietly for the rest of their lives. For Captain Lee, who died in 1973, Idar Castle remained his proudest moment. Friends recalled that he would sometimes describe it simply as a good day in a bad war. In the decades that followed World War II, the battle for Idar Castle remained one of those stories that seemed almost too extraordinary to be real. A fleeting moment when enemies became allies and humanity overcame hatred. Though overshadowed by the larger battles of the war, it became a symbol of moral courage, a reminder that even in the final days of destruction, decency could still prevail. For years after the war, the details of the battle were scattered across reports, diaries, and soldiers' recollections. It took time before historians pieced together the full picture of what had happened in that remote Austrian fortress. The official documents were few, and many who had taken part never sought recognition. Yet, as accounts emerged, the story gained strength. Passed from veterans to journalists, from local villagers to visiting scholars, until it became a legend of its own. In the town of Wurgel, the memory of Major Joseph Sepp Gangel endured the longest. To the people who lived there, he wasn't just a soldier. He was a man who had defied tyranny in its dying hours. His actions had saved not only the French prisoners but also countless civilians whom he had protected from SS reprisals in the last chaotic days of the Reich. Every year, the townspeople laid flowers on his grave, honoring the man who had chosen conscience over orders. The street that bore his name became a quiet reminder that heroism can exist even in the most unlikely places. For the French prisoners who had been rescued, life after the war took them in different directions. Edouard Daladier and Paul Reynaud returned to political life, each carrying the weight of history and the memory of their strange liberation. Daladier, who had been prime minister when France declared war on Germany in 1939, spoke occasionally about his time at Idar, calling it a story of redemption. Reynaud, known for his fiery opposition to Nazi Germany before the invasion, described the rescue as a miracle of humanity amid the ruins of reason. General Maurice Gamelin lived in quiet retirement, seldom speaking publicly about the war that had brought both his rise and his downfall. Yet, in private letters, he wrote about Captain Lee and Major Gangel with deep respect. In those two men, he wrote, I saw the spirit of soldiers who fight not for conquest but for honor. Jean Barotra, the tennis champion turned wartime hero, became the most public storyteller of them all. His athletic fame ensured that wherever he went, people asked about the war. He always recounted the story of Idar Castle with humility and excitement. How he had volunteered to slip past the enemy lines, how he ran through the dark forests to reach the Americans, and how he returned with help just in time. His courage made him a beloved figure not only in France but also among veterans who admired his bravery and optimism. For Captain John C. Jack Lee Jr., life after the war was quieter. He returned home to the United States, continued his service for a time, and eventually retired from the Army. Despite his Distinguished Service Cross and the admiration of his men, Lee remained modest about the battle that had defined his legacy. When asked years later if he had expected to survive that day, he reportedly smiled and said, I didn't think about it. We had people who needed help, and that was reason enough. Historians would later describe Lee as a man of instinct, practical, fearless, and deeply moral. In an age when war often blurred the lines between good and evil, he had made a simple human choice: to save lives, regardless of nationality. His partnership with Gangle was, in many ways, a metaphor for the hope that Europe could rebuild itself from the ashes of division. Idar Castle itself returned to its quiet existence after the war. For a time, it was used for various purposes, as a private residence, a guest house, even a storage site. But its walls still bore the scars of battle. Bullet holes, chipped stone, and faint traces of soot from the explosions of 1945. Visitors who came to see the site often remarked on the strange stillness that hung in the air, as if the old stones remembered. In the 1970s, new owners restored parts of the castle, and historians began to study the battle in greater detail. Local archives were searched, surviving participants were interviewed, and the events of May 5, 1945, were finally documented in full. The story appeared in books and magazines, each retelling emphasizing the same astonishing truth, that one of the final battles of World War II had united men from opposite sides of the conflict. In later years, the tale of Idar Castle would even attract filmmakers and authors. It appeared in documentaries and war histories, often described as the most unusual battle of World War II. Some dramatizations took liberties, but the essence remained the same: courage, unity, and the shared humanity that transcended the madness of war. What made the story so compelling was not its scale but its symbolism. It was not a battle that changed the course of the war, nor did it involve great armies or vast strategies. Instead, it was a microcosm of something greater, proof that individuals, even in the midst of hatred and destruction, could choose compassion over cruelty. In the final moments of a war defined by ideology and fanaticism, a handful of men showed that honor could still exist in unexpected forms. As the years passed, time blurred the details but not the meaning. The veterans grew old, and one by one they passed away. Yet their story outlived them. In the Austrian mountains, the villagers of Idar and Wergel continued to share the tale with visitors. The castle itself, though privately owned, remained a silent monument to an extraordinary event that seemed to belong more to legend than history. In 2013, renewed public interest in the story brought Idar Castle back into the spotlight. Historians and military researchers revisited the battle, and several new books were published, including detailed accounts that confirmed what had long been thought of as myth. The research showed how precise and coordinated the defense had been, how narrow their odds were, and how extraordinary the cooperation between Captain Lee, Major Gangle, and the French prisoners truly was. The legacy of the battle for Idar Castle endures not just as a curiosity of military history, but as a lesson in humanity. It reminds the world that even in the darkest times, individual choices can define what it means to be civilized. It tells us that courage can emerge in the most unexpected alliances, that mercy, decency, and honor are not bound by uniforms or borders. When the guns fell silent in Europe in May 1945, the continent was left scarred and broken. But stories like that of Idar Castle hinted at what could follow: reconciliation, understanding, and the possibility of peace built not on domination, but on shared humanity. Today, if you visit the Tyrolean mountains and look up at the old fortress of Idar, you can still imagine the scene of that long-ago day. A battered Sherman tank at the gate, smoke drifting across the courtyard, and men from 3 nations standing together against tyranny. It was, in every sense, a battle beyond logic, one last stand for honor at the end of a world consumed by war. And though time has eroded the details and the voices of those who fought there have faded into history, the spirit of that moment remains unbroken. A testament to what people can achieve when courage overcomes hatred, and when even in the chaos of war, humanity refuses to die.